From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please sign up at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening. This week, did that debate change the race? On Tuesday night, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris went head-to-head in what may be their only debate of the presidential campaign. There's no sugarcoating it for Republican supporters. Trump lost. Despite the fact that she is the vice president and has been the most loyal senior member of the Biden administration for the last 4 years, Harris managed to keep Trump on the defensive pretty much throughout the night, as though he were the incumbent. Instead of being forced to defend her record and explain her very recent Damascene conversion on just about every left-wing policy she's ever supported, it was Trump's record and character that were on the line. Instant polls suggest Harris prevailed. So how bad was it for the former president? What does he need to do to turn the campaign around, if indeed he needs to, in the next 7.5 weeks? This week, I talked about the debate and other matters with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Trump's newest campaign cheerleader. Last month, he ended his own bid for the presidency and was named honorary co-chair of Trump's campaign. We talked about the debate and what Trump needs to do next, but also about why Kennedy joined the Trump team and what he wants a second Trump term to achieve. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Very happy to be back with you, Gerry.
Lots happened since we last spoke when you were running as an independent for president. Now, you're supporting Donald Trump. There's a number of things I want to talk to you about. I know you want to talk about, too, some policy issues, but we're recording this Wednesday afternoon. Can we start, first of all, with Tuesday night's debate, President Trump and Kamala Harris in Philadelphia? We can talk about the moderation, which I'm sure you'll want to talk about, the way the media's dealt with it, but it wasn't a great night for Donald Trump, was it?
No, it was not. Clearly, based upon delivery and her polish and her preparation, I think most people would agree that Vice President Harris prevailed. When you look at the substance, when people look at the substance, I think that they support President Trump, but he did not do a good job of presenting his case. The first question was a question that gave him this enormous opportunity that was lost because the moderators at that point asked Vice President Harris whether Americans, it was the old Reagan question, the Reagan-Carter question, are Americans better off now than they were 4 years ago? And that is an impossible question for Vice President Harris to answer in a way that would be favorable to her case. Americans are much worse off by every indicia of social deterioration. The inflation rates are double. The housing costs are more than double. There are 15 million more Americans living below the poverty line. The suicide rates have broken every record. The drug overdose rates, 106,000 kids last year, are unprecedented in history. We're now involved in 2 wars, 2 foreign wars, and all of them attributable to the poor leadership and bad leadership decisions by the Biden team. In addition to that, the mental health and the physical health of Americans has continued to deteriorate, which you can't just blame on this White House, but clearly they have done nothing to stop it. So I think those are cases that Vice President Harris launched into a discussion of her middle-class roots in answer to that question and dodged the question, and nobody called her on it. The moderators who persistently fact-checked Donald Trump did not impose any kind of discipline on her, and President Trump lost the opportunity to do that as well. So, again, I think it was a lost opportunity.
If I may say so, you just there in a couple of minutes just laid out very well why Americans are not better off than they were 4 years ago. You gave a pretty straight and compelling answer. Why didn't Donald Trump do that?
It's hard for me to tell. I think he was prepared to do that, but Doris Kearns said this really well, that she really put a lot of preparation. And this was an excellent forum for Vice President Harris because they're 90-second sound bites. If you have a good team, they're going to anticipate 95% of the questions. And they're going to be able to give you really good answers. It's like taking the bar exam. If you have the capacity to memorize a certain amount of information, when my uncle did his debate in 1960, he prepared intensively for it. He had 100 file cards that he memorized the answers to, anticipating all the questions and the answers. And he was able to deliver those very smoothly. And Vice President Nixon at that time did not prepare well for the debate, and in the eyes of most Americans, lost it. And it had a transformative impact on the campaign. And I think the same thing happened last night. President Harris has not been able to do, I think she's very vulnerable if she does a long form interview, and she's been able to avoid interviews. Extraordinary. She's given one interview in the 40 odd days since she, got the nomination. But this is a particular kind of forum that I think is excellently suited toward her talents, which is you don't have to have depth on any of these issues. You have to have kind of a pithy answer that you can deliver in 90 seconds. And she did that very, very well.
Were you involved in any way at all in helping President Trump prepare?
No, I was not. I sent a couple of suggestions that were not taken, but I had nothing to do with the preparation. I don't think he spent a great deal of time.
Do you mind telling me what your suggestions were?
Specifically, that if they asked him about his unfortunate comment about her race, and instead of answering that he talked directly about her record on racial issues, and particularly the issue that I found in traveling around the country the last 18 months is the number one or number two issue to Black Americans, which is the school-to-prison pipeline. And Kamala Harris has been a public official for many years in California, which now has the worst social deterioration. San Francisco, which was once arguably our greatest city, is now just a kind of a hellhole. In California, we have the highest homeless rate. 50% of the homeless in America live in California. And we're 49th in school and educational outcomes. I mean, after Mississippi, this is extraordinary for the richest economy. This is the 9th richest economy in the world, the richest state in our country. And it's very, very bad leadership, but also specifically, President Harris was putting young Black men and Black boys in jail for marijuana when she admits that she was smoking marijuana herself at that time. When the Supreme Court ordered her to release 5,000 Black prisoners who were serving nonviolent drug crimes because of unconstitutionally cruel conditions in California's prison, she repeatedly defied Supreme Court orders because she said that the state needed those prisoners for fire suppression and for other tasks. This is like a kind of modern form of slavery. And she was a direct decision maker and participant in those decisions. And I think those are the issues that President Trump should have pivoted and focused on. But, I think a lot of times President Trump has certain issues that he's interested in, and he tends to focus on those rather than the issues that I think are persuasive to the public. I don't think the public cares about his crowd sizes.
Yeah, I think most people probably don't. Briefly, obviously, we should talk about the conduct of the debate. I think most people would agree the moderators were slanted. Do you think that made a significant impact to the way people viewed the debate?
I think it threw him off. It was a 3-1 fight. And I think that threw him off. And particularly that first question, when they let her get away with just not giving an answer, to giving this very, very evasive answer and clearly a canned response, and then immediately began fact-checking President Trump on these trivialities. And as far as I recall, they didn't fact-check her a single time. Maybe they did once, but I don't remember a single time. And they fact-checked him repeatedly. And I think that probably discombobulated him.
Do you think Donald Trump should do another debate? Do you think that's it?
I would advise him to do another one. If I was advising Vice President Harris, I'd probably advise her not to.
We're going to take a short break there. But when we come back, I'll have more with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We'll be talking about not just the campaign, but about what he hopes a second Trump term will achieve. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and we're talking about the remaining 7 weeks in the presidential election campaign. Let's talk about some of the issues. Well, first of all, explain to me, you've made your case for coming out and supporting Donald Trump. Still a lot of people are puzzled by it from your political career, your political history. Doesn't seem like you're a natural ally. Explain why you think that Donald Trump should be president of the United States.
I gave 3 issues. Listen, we have a choice between 2 candidates right now. And that's the way that our 2-party system has, I would say, devolved. So we have these 2 choices. And I think that President Trump after the shooting in Butler, I had a series of very intense and lengthy and detailed conversations with them and to look for areas of agreement. And the areas that I was surprised about the strength of his agreement was to end the wars. And he said that very well last night. He said, I'm going to end the Ukraine war, which I think is really important for our country. It's a war we should have never gotten into. It was a war of choice. It was a war that Putin has repeatedly tried to settle on terms that were very favorable to Ukraine and to us, and we refused to do it. And we've had 600,000 Ukrainian kids and 300,000 Russians die unnecessarily there, and the economic impacts are devastating Europe. Europe is being deindustrialized and economically destroyed, eviscerated by this war. We're also very close to nuclear war, closer according to the nuclear clock, and we've been at any time since 1948. So even 1962, which is a time that I remember very well, I was on my way with my brothers to being shipped to these bunkers in Southern Virginia. My uncle was then president. My father was attorney general and spent 13 days at the White House trying to avert the war. But I remember that very well. But today we're closer to nuclear war even than we were then. So I think that's very, very dangerous for our country, and President Trump understands that. I don't think Vice President has any clue about it, and I think that she is in the hands of the people who have orchestrated this situation and who are very satisfied with it. In other words, the neocons. One of the things that she did at the debate is she applauded her endorsement by Dick Cheney and John Bolton. And, there's 225 other neocons from the Bush administration or from the Mitt Romney's group endorsed her this week. And John McCain's group endorsed her this week. And they did not endorse her. These are the people that have been in exile for 20 years because of their role in creating the Iraq War, which was the biggest foreign policy debacle in American history, and then orchestrating the passage of the Patriot Act and the initiation of America away from being the world's exemplary democracy into becoming a security state, a surveillance state, a censorship state. And they have not changed their values or their position. They've been living in exile. They're endorsing Vice President Harris, not because they've come around and changed their position, but because they believe that she represents that position. And I think that by all indications she does. During the Democratic Convention, she gave this extraordinarily bellicose speech about essentially proclaiming U.S. global hegemony and the domination of the globe by U.S. military power. And at that convention, for the first time in history, you had a CIA director speaking before her, and you had generals and people from the military. This has never happened before at a Democratic convention. The Democrats used to be the party of peace. They are now the party of war, and that's one of the major reasons I think President Trump is going to be much better president. President Trump also opposes the censorship, which right now we're seeing the emergence of this totalitarianism across the globe. Europe no longer has free speech. This is an extraordinary development that should be reported every day in the news, and everybody, of course, is ignoring it because of the censorship. 2 weeks ago, you had Pavel Durov, the head of Telegram, pulled off an airplane that he landed for a fuel stop in France and thrown into a prison. And by the way, Europe is already censoring content on the internet. There's no reason for them to arrest Pavel Durov. They did that to show their strength, to show that they are going to punish people who cross them. It's really an extraordinary. And by the way, France, with this happened, had as a robust commitment and tradition of free speech as we have in the United States. France passed all of these laws protecting free speech in 1789 during the French Revolution, and then they passed a new raft of laws in the 1880s, and their pride in it, their commitment to it has been as strong as ours here in the United States, and now it's gone. A week before that, you had Thierry Breton, who was the chairman of the European Commission, threaten Elon Musk that if he interviewed Donald Trump live on X, that he faced criminal and civil prosecution, and civil prosecution for the value, for 6% of the value of his company. It would be existential for him. And this is a live interview with the former president of the United States and the current nominee of one of the two big political parties in our country. And the Europeans are saying that this is too dangerous for Europeans or Americans to hear that debate. This is extraordinary. And then last week, you had Brazil censor Twitter, remove Twitter and or X so the Brazilians can no longer hear it. And they're doing the same thing now with a number of the other social media platforms. But we're seeing this rise of totalitarianism and censorship all over across the world. America needs to be the fortification, and we need to be the beacon around the world as the exemplary democracy for the one place where we can still have free speech, where people can still criticize their government, where dissenters don't have to be frightened that they're going to be locked in jail or that they're going to be punished. And I don't think Vice President Harris has any understanding of that. She has repeatedly said that free speech is a privilege, not a right. She says that if people who put disinformation and misinformation on that's not protected by the First Amendment, which, by the way, it is. First Amendment protects all speech. It protects lies as well as the truth. It was written not to protect convenient speech, but to protect speech that nobody wants to hear, that nobody wants us to hear. And that is critical. When the government becomes the arbiter of what's true and what's not true, then that's the end of free speech, and that's the beginning of slavery. And then the biggest issue for me is children's health and the health of our society. We're now the sickest country in the world, and President Trump has a commitment to end that.
I want to get onto that because you read an article in the Wall Street Journal last week called Trump Can Make America Healthy Again. I know this is a very important topic, very dear to your heart, but some of the issues that you've championed, particularly over things like vaccines and your allegations that all kinds of vaccines cause enormous harm in children's health, to public health generally, some of those, as you know, are very controversial. A lot of people challenge them. Do you think a Trump administration would be sympathetic to your skepticism about and your opposition to vaccines? And could we expect that to be a feature of health policy in a Trump administration?
Well, I don't have a hostility to vaccines at all. The term anti-vax is a pejorative that is applied to me by people who want to silence me. But it's not something I've said for 20 years. I'm not anti-vaccine. I vaccinated all my kids. I got on my own. I was fully vaccinated and compliant. I didn't get the COVID vaccine. Some of my kids did. Some of them did not. But what I am for is I'm pro-science, and I'm for removing the corruption and the corrupt entanglements, the corrupt control that the pharmaceutical industry has over our public health agencies. And I think all Americans would agree to that. I want good science. If I were in charge of, if I were president myself, I would do nothing to prevent people who are happy with their vaccines from getting those vaccines. So all I want to do is to make sure that people are well informed, that they have informed consent. In other words, that they have a full understanding of the risks and the benefits of these products, and that the products are adequately tested so that we know exactly what the risk profile is for them. I think what my issue is really common sense. My approach is common sense. And I think that's very, very threatening to the pharmaceutical industry. And as a result of that, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical cartel, the allied media tries to tar me with being anti-science and anti-vax. But I've never, ever advocated a ban on vaccines.
So what do you expect from a Trump administration? Again, you laid out a lot of things that need to be done in that article last week, and I'm sure you've had conversations with Donald Trump about this. What do you expect a Trump administration to do in terms of public health policy?
The reason we have the worst health, when my uncle was president and I was a little boy, so I was 10 years old, we spent zero annually on chronic disease in this country, zero. We didn't even have any drugs for treating it. Today, we spend $4.3 trillion. It's about 95% of our healthcare costs. And we've gone from 3.2% of Americans being obese to 74%. We've gone from 6% of Americans having chronic disease to 60%. We're the sickest country in the world. We had the highest death rate, body count from COVID of any country on earth. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States. We only have 4.2% of the world's population. And when you ask CDC, why did we do worse than any country in the world under COVID? They say, because we're the sickest country. We have the sickest people. The average American, according to CDC, who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had asthma, they had obesity, they had diabetes, and one other thing. And that's why we did worse than anybody else. So if we want to protect public health, we've got to eliminate chronic disease. Why do we have chronic disease? It's because of perverse incentives, because of the corrupt capture by the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry of the regulatory agencies. The most valuable, the most profitable asset today in America is a sick child. If you can make a child sick, which we do with our food system, the pharmaceutical industry can profit from that child forever. If he has a chronic disease, it means he has a lifetime of dependence on pharmaceutical drugs. And that is a giant profit center. And that's why, Ozempic, for example, under a new bill that's being passed in the House that is paid for by the maker of Ozempic, Novo Nordisk, it's a bipartisan bill that is likely to pass both chambers because of legalized bribery by the biggest company in Europe. Ozempic will now be available under Medicare. I think it's $1,500 a month to every American who qualifies. That's 74% of the American public. The cost of that to our country will be $3 trillion a year. You could eliminate diabetes in this country by a tiny fraction of that just by buying organic meal for every American 3 meals a day, which would be a tiny fraction of that cost. Diabetes is absolutely curable by food, but we don't do that. Instead, we pay people to eat bad food, to eat poison food like substances that are just loaded with chemicals. We use 1,000 chemicals in this country on our food that are illegal in Europe. And about 70% of our food stamp program is going to those ultra-processed foods, the seed oils to ultra-processed sugar, ultra-processed starch, and all these chemical contaminants. About 70% of our school lunch program, we're poisoning our children. 10% of food stamps goes to sugar drinks, which is causing the diabetes and obesity epidemics. And then the feedstock, which is soy, corn, and wheat, that goes into that food are these GMO monocultures that farmers are growing because they're paid to grow them. And they're paid giant subsidies. Only about 2% of agricultural subsidies are going to fruit and vegetables. The beef industry gets almost nothing. Those are the cures for diabetes. And instead, we're making people sick on one end by paying, these absurd subsidies, incentives. And then we're paying for the medicine and the treatment for life. And it makes no sense. It's destroying our country. 70% of American kids are now ineligible to join the military because of health reasons. This is destroying our national security. It's destroying our economy. It's destroying the health and happiness of our people, and we've got to end it.
Finally, Mr. Kennedy, Donald Trump has named you and Tulsi Gabbard and others to his transition team to help pick the team that will be in the next Trump administration. Well, I have two questions. First of all, have you talked to Mr. Trump about a role for yourself in that administration? And secondly, what kind of an administration will you be trying to build? Again, you are politically somewhat at odds, I think it's fair to say, with many of the things that Donald Trump has said or stood for. He said some very critical things about you in the past. What do you think Trump is trying to do by naming you? What kind of an administration is he trying to create?
I think he's trying to bring our country together and end the polarization. And, when we talked about how to bring our campaigns together, we talked about starting a unity government where independents like myself could ally themselves like they do in European countries where you have coalitions between big political parties, who could ally themselves with the Republican Party, with Republicans on Capitol Hill. It doesn't mean that we endorse everything he says or agree with everything, and we agreed that we'd be able to continue to criticize each other, but on the issues on which we differ. But on the most important issues, to me, the existential issues, which are censorship and surveillance, the ending the forever wars and making America healthy again, we're going to work together on those issues. And we're going to create a unity government. We're going to end the polarization. And we're going to bring Americans together around the health of our children. We can bring our country together. We can end the chronic disease epidemic. We just have to start loving our children more than we hate each other. And that's what the Make America Healthy Again is all about. It's about loving our children more than we hate each other.
And have you talked to Mr. Trump about a role for yourself?
Not about a specific role, but generally, yeah. I mean, he wants me to help clean up the agencies, clean up the corruption, end this corrupt merger of state and corporate power, drain the swamp. And I've had 40 years of doing that. I've litigated against almost all these agencies. I know who the bad actors are in many of them. I know the perverse incentives that put agency capture on the steroids. And I've agreed to do that. But in terms of a specific role, we have not decided.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks very much for joining us. I'll be back next week with another episode of Free Expression. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.